Welcome back to the Mercy Cast, where we're learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. Today I want to talk about the version of ourselves that we project. Whether we know it or not, we are all masters at image management. We are good at really just curating a view of ourselves that may not be the authentic self. We project this view of ourselves to others because it may be our aspirational view of ourselves. It may be what we want people to see so that they'll accept us. It may come from our own desires to please people. But at the end of the day, what we put out there isn't always the true us. I remember Chris Rock once said that when you go on dates, you're not dating the person, you're dating their representative. And I think that's so true for all of us. We are all putting our representative out there before we put our true self out there. And we do it for real reasons. Like we don't want to be hurt. We don't want to not be loved. But the problem is that this is a house of cards and it will always fall in on us. Behavior modification was a way of life for Justin from an early age. He became a master of adjusting his behavior to fit different social situations. However, he, like so many of us, projected the best version of himself rather than allowing people to truly know him. And this inevitably resulted in his life falling apart. Today, I'm joined by Justin Davis, who's the co-founder of Refine Us Ministries and co-author of Beyond Ordinary, When a Good Marriage Just Isn't Good Enough. He wrote that with his wife, Trisha. Now, his new book, Being Real is Greater Than Being Perfect, How Transparency Leads to Transformation, is what we're going to talk about today. Justin, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you.
I have been talking about perfectionism in my own journey on this podcast for the last year. And so when I see a book title called Being Real is Greater Than Being Perfect, I'm like, I got to get this guy on the show. Like he has to be a part of what we're doing because these are dangerous waters. We don't want to admit our imperfections.
Yeah, I think that we're all, even if you look back to the first human beings, when there was only two people on the entire planet, their first response to imperfection was to hide and then to blame. And so we've kind of inherited that dysfunction from generation to generation. And now with social media and just the way that we are connected to one another, it's easier than ever to try to hide those imperfections and really be an inauthentic version of ourselves.
And when you talk about this idea of hiding and blaming, I think we can often do that under the auspices of behavioral modification. I grew up hearing the short phrase, don't drink, don't chew, don't run with girls that do. As long as I'm doing the right things and not doing the wrong things, then I'm acceptable. But this is a false gospel. This is not true. This is a gospel of works. And we kind of put this on other people saying, well, just look the part. I've actually been told that. I've had people say, it's not good enough to just be the genuine article. You need to look the part as well. And that might be well-meaning, but this behavioral modification, it renders disastrous results every time. And so could you tell me how you learned the art of behavioral modification, but how that came crashing in on you?
Yeah, I think from a young age, one of the stories I share in the book is when I was growing up, we lived kind of out in the country, and I loved to play in mud puddles, and I was probably 6 or 7 years old at the time, and my dad would routinely tell me not to play in this mud puddle. And he came home from work one afternoon, maybe earlier than I thought he was going to get there, and I'm sitting in our driveway playing in this mud puddle. I remember so vividly. I had on cut off jean shorts. My mom had taken a pair of jeans that maybe were too short for me and just made them into a pair of shorts. And so I'm sitting there, no shirt and a pair of cowboy boots and playing in this mud puddle. My dad comes home. He doesn't say a word. He just gets out of the car and literally spanks me all the way up the driveway. And that was when, physical punishment was not child abuse, or maybe it was, we just didn't identify it as that back in the 80s. But anyway, I just remember thinking, okay, I'm never going to play in a mud puddle again, not because I stopped liking them, but because I didn't want to ever get spanked like that again. And I think as I grew up, I learned to modify my behavior in dating. I learned to modify my behavior at church, at school. Like I had these different versions of myself that I created to be the most appropriate and the most put together in whatever environment I was in. And I think that really defined my relationship with God for so many years. And even when I went into becoming a pastor out of college, I carried that behavior modification. It was almost like I was performing for God rather than being in a relationship with Him.
Yeah, as long as I don't do this, then I'm acceptable.
Yeah.
And we learn that. It becomes a way of life.
Right. And I think, when I say, being real is greater than being perfect, I've had some people push back and be like, oh, you're saying we shouldn't be holy? Well, I mean, yeah, there is a few translations that translate the word holy as perfect, but a more accurate translation for holiness is set apart. And so this isn't saying we shouldn't be holy because God commands us to be holy, but holiness is really being set apart. It's living differently than the world, where being perfect carries this connotation of I'm going to focus more on my performance than I am my heart. And I think that Jesus actually came to abolish that mindset and really that theological belief system.
Well, and different authors like Pete Scazzaro, who has written the Emotionally Healthy series, so many of his books I've just found to be very helpful. And I didn't want to read them because everyone was telling me, man, these are the best books. You got to read them. And I'm like, no, I'm still a little punk rock. We grew up in the same time period. And for me, it's like, if everyone else is doing something, there's still that part of me that's like, I don't know. I still kind of have to die to that. But when I finally read Scazzaro, there's so much of emotional health that is grounded in accepting where you are before you can change and being able to see who you are. And he says that Christ didn't die for this false version of you. He died for the real you.
Yeah, that's good.
And I think that really does tie us into this idea of being set apart, because everyone and their sister is pushing out this view that, I've got it together. When what would happen if we just embraced the gift of imperfection and said, you know what? I'm not okay. You're not okay. And that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that there is, there is this aspect of Christianity where so many people are going to church. More people are going to church today than any time in human history, primarily because there's more people on the planet today than any time in human history. But very few people are changing, right? And so when we don't experience the life change that we feel like Christianity promises us, then we're tempted to do one of two things. We're tempted to either pretend to be better than we really are, or we just give in to the fact that we're never going to be able to change. And so there's this dynamic of either, despair that I'm never going to change. I'm never going to be a better husband. I'm never going to be a better father. I'm never going to, be able to get over my anger issues. I'm never going to be able to get over this addiction. Or I know I can't get over it, so I'm just going to pretend that I am more spiritual than I really am, so other people don't see this imperfection in my life. And I think both of those things rob us of the gift of transformation that Jesus, brings. And, one of the things I say in the book is God will not transform who you pretend to be. God doesn't heal the parts of our heart we don't bring to Him. And so I think it's really important, as you said, just to acknowledge that imperfection so that we at least have a starting place.
Well, how did you learn that lesson that God doesn't transform who we pretend to be?
Man, is this a podcast series? I'm just joking. I wish I would have learned. Actually, Raleigh, I wish I would have learned it a long time ago. Unfortunately, I didn't learn it till I was in my early 30s, and I'd been a pastor for 10 years. I'd been married for 10 years. I had 3 little kids, and my life came crashing down because I had an affair with my wife's best friend, who was also on our church staff. And all of this posturing and all of this effort that I had put into Christianity and put into being a pastor and put into being a performance in my relationship with God, it wasn't all false. It was actually the best that I could create in my own strength.
Mm-hmm.
But willpower can only go so far, and trying only goes so far. And so my wife and I were separated in 2005 for 2.5 months. Wasn't really sure if my marriage was going to make it. And we were, I was living 4 miles from my house. A family that helped us start our church agreed to let me stay there. And God began to break my heart for my marriage again. And my wife called me 10 days into our separation and said that she was willing to go to counseling with me. And so we started going to counseling, and I'd never gone to counseling before because as a pastor, I was terrified that if I went to counseling, this guy would be able to see just how much of a mess I was. And I just resisted it. And now everything was out. Like everybody knew I was a mess. And so I felt like I had hit rock bottom and I had nothing left to lose. So we started going to counseling and went to counseling 4 days a week for 2 months. But 30 days into counseling, our counselor said, if you've left anything out about the affair, you need to come clean now, because unconfessed sin always leads to repeated behavior. And that statement just stuck with me. And it made literally everything I had struggled with since I was like 12 years old make sense. Like all of these things that I had hidden, all these things that I hadn't confessed, all of these things that I had been dishonest about or pretended to be more spiritual about were all of the sins that I just could not find freedom from. And so I really felt like the Holy Spirit was just saying, hey, you need to come clean. And so I shared with my wife and my counselor that I had been sexually abused when I was a kid, and I'd never told anyone about it. And I had struggled with pornography for the first 10 years of our marriage and never talked about it, never confessed it, lied about it. And I wish that it was this just super spiritual moment. It was very devastating for my wife to hear that. But she said something in that moment that really changed the trajectory of my life. It changed the trajectory of our relationship. She said, now we can start over. Now we can begin again because I finally know the real you. And it was just this moment of being fully known and knowing that I was fully loved that really changed the course of my life. And because I had never really seen God that way either, I just felt like if God really knew me, he would not love me. And that caused me to hide. It caused me to pretend. It caused me to try to be perfect, or at least to pretend to be perfect. And so it was in that moment that I began to realize that, as kind of the subtitle of the book says, that it is transparency that leads to transformation. I wasn't capable of changing until I was honest with myself, honest with God, and honest with others.
And you touch on a good point there. Every one of us wants to be loved as we are, but we're so scared to show the real self because we have shown these parts of ourselves, our rougher edges, to other people, and they walked away.
Yeah.
People didn't want to be there for that. And so I think a lot of us, we project this version of ourselves into the light when we're living with our own darkness that it's just hard to manage. Like we're praying that people don't see certain sides of ourselves, because if they see them, they'll walk away. And so we live these duplicitous lives. And you talk a lot about that in your book. How do we get to that point where we're able to be transparent and just trust that we will be loved?
Yeah. Well, and I don't think, I want to assume that everyone listening to this podcast, none of us probably want to be duplicitous. None of us want to be two-faced. None of us want to have hidden parts of our heart. We don't compromise truth in relationships because we want to be liars.
Right.
We compromise truth in relationships because we want to be loved. And so we put a pain quotient on every relationship we have. And we think this is as much pain as this person can handle. So this is as much truth as I'm going to give them. Right. And so, and there's certain things that are appropriate. You don't want to share everything about your life on Facebook, right? Like That's not an appropriate vulnerability. But there are relationships that God brings into our life, whether that be with a small group or a close friend or a spouse if you're married, or a dating relationship, where in order for a person to fully love you, they have to fully know you. Like, we can only be loved to the extent that we're known. And so I think it is fear of rejection that causes us more than anything else to hold back or to not be vulnerable or honest about our imperfections. And I think depending on how you grew up and your view of God, that could be a stumbling block in your relationship with God too. Like, if you view God as someone who just wants to come down on you, or just wants to catch you, or just wants to bring wrath against you, or just wants to, punish you, it's going to affect how honest and vulnerable you are with him as well. And that was one of the things that I learned, when I was at my lowest point, is that God knows me fully and he loves me anyway. And that's grace. And even if everybody else walks out of the room, God walks in the room, right? Like, even if what you have done or who you have hurt or the mistakes that you've made are so egregious that nobody in your life wants to do life with you, that doesn't describe God's view of you. And I think when Jesus was all I had, I realized that he was all I needed. And that changed my relationship with him.
And you mentioned this idea of the way we view God is going to be seen in how we respond to him. So if we run to him, we see him as this loving God who loves us as we are. But if we're afraid, or if we're just going through the motions and phoning it in and just pretending until we break, then we don't see him as a loving father. We may believe in the gospel, but we're not trusting in it in that moment. We're seeing God through the lens of maybe our earthly fathers or some of the leaders that we've followed before in our lives, rather than how the Bible portrays him.
Yeah. Well, I saw a meme a few months ago. I don't know if it was on Instagram or some social media outlet, and basically it was kind of allowing you to define how you see God through two statements. I messed up. I hope God doesn't find out. Or I messed up. I need to go tell God. Right? And how you respond after a mistake in your relationship with God is an indication of how you view him. Right? And so if you feel like, man, I hope God doesn't find that out, then that is an indicator of how you view your relationship with God, and that mistakes and imperfections are something that he can't handle, or he would be ashamed of, or he won't forgive. But if you recognize that, I love the title of your podcast, Mercy Cast, that God casts mercy upon us, right? That he brings us mercy and he brings us grace, then your willingness to confess those things is going to be higher, because it's how you view God, that his mercies never end.
My whole view of God shifted when I picked up a book at a half-price books, and it was by Jerry Bridges, and it was called Transforming Grace. And I just remember reading the back cover, and he says, this is how you know what you really think about grace. If you sin and you do something egregious, whatever it is, and you don't feel like you can go to God or his people afterwards, you feel too much shame, then that is a sign that you do not believe in that moment in grace, that you do not believe that you are loved regardless of your flaws. Yeah. And it changed everything for me, because I realized that if I messed up, I would have to wear it off in a sense. I'd be like, okay, I need a couple of days, and then in a couple of days, I'll be lovable again. It was like I put myself in this weird spiritual timeout. And
I mean,
the reality is that's not what's happening.
But don't you think that, shame is like a driving factor of that? Like the shame that we feel. I tell parents, I've been married for 28 years. I've got a 27, 24, 20, 15, or 16 and 14-year-old. So I tell parents all the time, you don't need to tell your kids they should be ashamed of themselves.
No.
They feel shame naturally.
And I think it's realizing just the role of shame, because I think shame, like you said, it leads to us hiding.
Yeah.
It leads to us running from rather than running to.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the fact that Jesus bore our shame on the cross, like he took our shame upon himself to set us free, then it frees us to at least start down the road of viewing God, like you said, as a father that we can run to and say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. And you already know it, but I'm confessing it, because that advice that you got, I think, so beautiful. Unconfessed sin leads to repeated behavior, because it's true. If we're not shining light on those dark places in our lives, then we can always go back there. But if we find even just a trusted friend or mentor or spouse that we can say, here's where I am, and this is who I am right now.
Yeah.
This is part of me. I had this explained to me once. A friend said, well, this area is part of you, but it's not the whole you. And so how do you live in a way where it doesn't get the driver's seat? And that was just kind of like a Copernican revolution for me, because I was like, you're right. So I can live with this shadow self, this part that's there, and not have to be perfect. I can live with it, but I don't have to give it the driver's seat. And I think being aware helps me be transparent. And how do you think our self-awareness and our self-acceptance helps us to grow in transparency to others?
Well, I mean, I think, the greatest of all deception is self-deception. And so, because if you're deceiving yourself, then everything you say to others is filtered through that self-deception. And so I think being honest with yourself is like the first step to transformation, right? And so it takes courage to be self-aware. It takes humility to be self-aware. And one of the things I've found is, in my own life personally, if I'm not willing to be humble, then I'm usually in line to be humiliated.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like, I feel like God gives us opportunities to choose humility. And then if we don't choose humility, usually the culmination of our choices will lead to a place of humiliation. And that's kind of been, a place for me to go, okay, God, if I can just be honest, if I can just be self-aware, if I can just admit weakness, if I could admit a struggle, or if I could admit a wound that I've experienced, then you say that you give grace to the humble, but you oppose the proud. And so I'm going to lean in, and I'm going to choose humility, and I'm going to find your grace in this area. And I think that, I don't know, sometimes I wonder, we give the Israelites a hard time for taking 40 years to get to the promised land on what should have taken, I don't know what some scholars say, a few days. But I think sometimes we take the long way around too, just because we're not willing to be self-aware.
I just had this conversation in another interview with Michelle Kashat. And as I was talking with her, she brought up this image of how the Israelites languished in the desert, in this place of desolation for 40 years. And I'm like, that passage always frustrates me, because they could have got there in less than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I always want the fast track. I don't want to wait. I don't want to grow slowly. And sometimes sanctification is this mysterious work that takes time, but God's always working.
Right.
He's growing us, but it's messy. And I think it's the moments where I try to fast track it, when I try to microwave it, that's kind of when I end up hitting a wall.
Yeah.
And that ultimately leads me to perfectionism, because if I can show you that I'm perfect and I have no flaws, then I'm lovable.
Right.
Then I'm enough.
Right.
And how do you think we become perfectionists though? That's my,
I think, don't you think that perfectionism, it can sometimes appear to be arrogant, or it can appear to be confident, but it's really born out of insecurity, right? We're not choosing to be perfectionists because we necessarily want to do things right. I want the perception of you thinking that I'm doing things right. Right. So it's not even about the actual performance itself. It's about what other people believe to be true about my performance, or about my choice, or about my whatever. And so I think that, recognizing that aspect of insecurity of, okay, why do I care about what people think so deeply? Why am I driven by people pleasing? Why am I driven by the opinions of others? Why am I driven by what I hope people believe to be true about me? And I think I've had enough failures that have taken place in public that have helped me realize that, sometimes your greatest weakness or your greatest struggle could actually be the thing that God uses to help other people find the most freedom or the most help. And I think you said it earlier, like we don't get to choose what we're called to do. We don't get to choose the message that we're called to share. And I think sometimes when we're open to it and we recognize that, man, my insecurity is driving my behavior here, it allows us to step back and then defeat that insecurity and leverage whatever it is that we're struggling with to help other people.
No, I think that's right. And it's funny, as I've embraced my own brokenness and accepted myself for who I am in a moment, that doesn't mean I love it. That doesn't mean I like where I'm at. If I accept okay, this is where you are today in this moment, well, then I can change it. But you can't change something that you haven't accepted.
Right. Well, I think there's an aspect, that's what the Bible calls surrender, right? And I think what we're talking about is it's not being okay with the sin in your life and it's just, I am who I am. It's
right.
More of acknowledging who we are, but then also rather than trying harder to either please God or perform for God or perform for others, surrendering more and just saying, God, I need more of you, more of your spirit, more of your power. I need, more of your transformation. I think that's probably a key that many of us, when you were bringing your Bible and getting a star and you had perfect attendance in Sunday school and you had your memory verses, you were kind of conditioned that if you do this and this and this and this, then God's going to throw you an eternal pizza party. And I think that version of Christianity is leaving a lot of people disillusioned and discouraged right now.
So you're saying the marriage supper of the Lamb is not an eternal pizza party. That's what you're saying. You just kind of destroyed my whole eschatology, man.
Sorry. Virginia Vanice, my 5th grade Sunday school teacher, really, that was her theological view, I think.
Well, I love how you touched on this idea of confession, because I think when we confess, it's so much easier to confess when we've accepted where we are. And now we're agreeing with God, who already knows what we're doing. And we're saying, yes, God, this is where I'm at. I'm confessing this. And I think in that sense, God's giving us a gift and allowing us to confess, because now his posture towards us is grace.
Yeah.
And we're able to say, this is where I'm at. Help. Grace flows to the darkest, farthest reaching parts of my soul. And I just need as much grace as possible. Just pour it out, grow me, change me, heal me. But I know that I'm not the solution. And I think it takes accepting what we've done and where we are, in a sense, before we confess it to God. Because if I'm just running from it, I'm not confessing it. I'm just managing it.
Yeah.
And I'm doing that poorly.
Right. Well, I love that passage in James chapter 5, verse 16 that says, confess your sins to one another and pray for each other. Because because there isn't that you would get forgiveness, because we're already forgiven.
Right.
But the because is so that you will be healed.
Yeah.
Right. And so God is saying in his word that there is a cathartic thing. There's a healing aspect of confession. And I would go as far to say that there is a part of healing that you cannot experience apart from confession, right? And so it's as we confess our sins, and even in Revelation, it says it's the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, right? So there's an aspect of sharing our story and sharing our wounds and sharing our mistakes that bring actually healing to our heart, and then also hope and healing for others.
And is this how you would define authenticity? This idea of just being gut level honest about who you are in that moment?
Yeah, there's obviously a number of different definitions for authenticity. I think how I view authenticity is I want who I am in this conversation to be the same as who I am at home, who I am on a stage, who I am at my kid's game. And obviously, there's an appropriate level of vulnerability that we offer in each of those things, but there's also an integration. Duplicity is actually having, basically, it means two faces. So you're two different people. Where integrity is, there's an integration of all aspects of your life into that make who you are, and it's seamless. It's consistent. And I think authenticity is the cry of many, but it's the game of few. And we all want to be a part of an authentic church. We all want to be a part of authentic faith communities. And we all look at the fall of mega church pastors to scandals and say, well, see, I knew the church wasn't a place of authenticity. Well, the problem with that is we are the church. Followers of Jesus are the church. And so we can't bring inauthenticity into our communities of faith and magically think that we're going to have authentic churches. The movement of authenticity has to start with the individual. And then as we come together collectively in communities of faith, that's where we have the opportunity to point people to Jesus, who takes on all of our sin and doesn't demand that we be perfect, that we can come to him as we are, and he transforms us into who we're created to be.
And so being honest about our weakness, you say in your book that that's the path to transformation.
Yeah.
And so doing this individually will ultimately lead to transformation corporately. And I think that's such a great idea.
I mean, I think look at the people who were closest to Jesus were the most honest with him. Right? I mean, Thomas doubted, Peter denied him. There was a number of different, Mary and Martha, Jesus, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. So there was this level of authenticity that the people that traveled with Jesus and spent the most time with him had. John the Baptist, are you really the Messiah, or should we expect another? Right? So there was this freedom that people had. They recognized him as the Son of God, and they acknowledged him as the Messiah, but they also felt very comfortable being sarcastic, being honest, being hurt, questioning his authority, questioning his plans. And so I think that there is a proper respect that we should pay to God, but there's also an aspect of our relationship that in order to experience transformation, it has to be real, and it has to be authentic, and it has to be, there has to be a willingness there to be, brutally honest.
Well, I think when you know you're loved, like if it's a family member, significant other, a friend, when you know they love you, you feel like you can be completely free.
Yeah.
And you're not going to lose their love.
Right.
But if you're trying to earn their love, that's when we start posturing. That's when we start pretending.
Yeah, that's good.
You talk about this idea of, in Luke 9:23, Jesus kind of posits this idea of self-denial and dying to ourselves. What do you think it means to die to ourselves in this context?
Well, I mean, I think for me, as I think about dying to myself, it's not that my hopes and dreams have to die. It's not that my personality has to die. I think dying to ourselves is a daily decision to put away the false selves that we've created. Brennan Manning calls them imposters, and allow the person of Jesus to live more in me today than he did yesterday. And it's acknowledging that on my best day, I am a messed up sinner in need of grace, but my past doesn't define me. I'm not a sum of my mistakes. My shame doesn't get to be, as you said, in the driver's seat. That I am redeemed. I am chosen. I am loved. I am forgiven. And living out of that identity allows me to put to death the person that I used to be, so that I can live out God's future for me.
Living out of our new true identity helps us to deny the other.
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't work for us anymore.
Right.
And sometimes old habits die hard, but...
Well, I was going to say, when I share my story, people are like, man, do you get tired of living in the past? I'm like, well, I'm telling you a story that's 18 years old. I'm not even that person anymore. Right? Like I'm sharing, it is me, but I'm telling you a story about someone who doesn't exist anymore. And so I'm not necessarily, I want to remember the past because I don't want to go back there. But I think that's why Paul calls himself the chief of all sinners, right? Was he the greatest sinner of all time? No, he was the greatest evangelist of all time. But I think he postures himself that way so that he can remember the grace of God and how much it transformed his life, and that he went from Saul to Paul. He didn't just change his name. Everything about him changed. He went from killing Christians to converting Christians, right? And so I think for me, as I look at the past, it's something that I want to remember because it reminds me just how amazing God's grace is and just how scandalous it is that I could be that low and I could have messed up that deeply, and yet he forgave and he restored and he redeemed.
Yeah. And when you talk about being that low, I'm reminded of something you wrote about how transformation often comes with desperation.
Hmm.
Could you tell me a little bit more about that idea?
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit off air before we started recording of how most of us don't change until the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like most people don't go to marriage counseling proactively. Something breaks or someone says, I'm done. Oh, no, let's go to counseling. We don't go to financial peace when we have $1 million in the bank.
Right.
Like we're going there when we're, $30,000 in debt. Like there's a pain that comes into our life that we can't ignore any longer. We're like, oh, maybe I should change. For me, I allowed the pressure of ministry to allow me to gain weight, and I was out of shape, and I went to the hospital one night thinking I was having a heart attack, and my blood pressure was way high. And so it wasn't until that experience, I'm like, well, maybe I should change my diet. Maybe I should start exercise. Maybe I should lose some weight. Right. And so I think we all have those things in our life. And I think our relationship with God can oftentimes be the same way. And when we become desperate for God, we don't have to become desperate for change, because as we're desperate for him, he brings the transformation that we need. I heard someone say, trying to sin less doesn't make you sin less, but loving God more will make you sin less, right? Like, so you can try to sin less. It's not going to necessarily allow you to sin less, but when you love God more, it'll cause you to want to sin less. And I think, that's the idea of that desperation. I think I just jacked that whole saying up, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to say.
No, and it touches on that idea that we're always going to gravitate towards behavioral modification. But if we address the thing behind the thing, that is ultimately going to change the whole thing for us. And as we connect to the love of God, which is what we've always needed, what we were designed to live in light of, when we connect to that, that does transform all the other things. They kind of fall in line.
Yeah, that's good.
And so, Justin, as we close, how would you encourage our listeners who are trying to think through how to live transparent lives that are transformative?
Oh, that's a good question. I think all of us want to have relationships where we can be honest, but as we were talking earlier, they have to be safe. They have to be trusted, right? So I don't think you should share your deepest, darkest secrets with everyone.
That's
right. But I do think everybody needs one or two people in their life they can be fully known with, so they can know that they're fully loved. And so if you're walking in this tightrope of, man, what if they don't love me, or what if they reject me, or what if it changes our relationship? I would just say, be honest with yourself first. Be honest with God. And then pray that God would bring the right person into your life where you can have that transparent relationship. And God change me is a very dangerous prayer, because it's a prayer he will always answer. Sometimes he doesn't answer in the way that we want, but we often look at circumstances and pray that God would change our circumstances. And what God's trying to do is he's trying to transform us through our circumstances. And so being willing to be humble, being willing to be teachable, being willing to be vulnerable, those are all risky things to do. But the payoff of those things is far greater than the cost, because it brings into our life something that we can't produce on our own. and that is heart transformation. It is God that brings change to a human heart. And if we're willing to pay the price up front, one of the things I share all the time is that short-term misery for long-term transformation is a trade worth making. And so there might be some short-term misery you have to go through, but that long-term transformation is something that is priceless.
Justin, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciated being here.